The motivation of mud. Hey guys. Tonight, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to step away from the gilded palaces and the velvet cushions of the Habsburgs, just for a moment. We aren't looking up at towering cathedral spires or imposing castle walls. Instead, I want you to dim the lights down low, maybe grab that extra blanket, and get comfortable. Because tonight, we are going underground. We're going to talk about dirt. Lots and lots of dirt. And specifically, why medieval people, who already had pretty difficult lives on the surface, decided it would be a good idea to grab a wooden shovel and start digging straight down. It's a topic that doesn't get a lot of attention in the history books, mostly because history books are usually written by people who prefer fresh air and sunlight. But for a significant chunk of human history, the best real estate strategy was simply to become invisible. So, just let your eyes get heavy, and let's drift back to a time when the only reliable home security system was 5 feet of solid earth between you and the rest of the world. Now, before we get into the specifics of how you actually construct a livable hole in the ground using only inadequate iron tools and sheer desperation, we have to talk about the why. Because nobody wakes up on a Tuesday in 1348 and decides to turn their living room into a root cellar just for the aesthetic. The primary motivation for going subterranean in the medieval period was, unsurprisingly, other people. Specifically, other people with swords, horses, and a distinct lack of hobbies. If you were a peasant living on the surface world, your life was essentially an open-air buffet for whatever marauding army happened to be passing through on their way to a slightly more important marauding army. You lived in a wattle and daub hut that could be knocked over by a stiff breeze, or more likely, burned down by a bored mercenary from Brabant because his captain didn't pay him on time. Above ground, you were visible. Being visible meant you were taxable, and being taxable usually meant you were also pillageable. The kings and dukes we usually talk about, the ones with the fancy nicknames like the Bold or the Magnificent, spent most of their time making life incredibly inconvenient for everyone else. When two royal cousins decided to have a disagreement over who owned a particularly soggy patch of land in Flanders, the people who actually lived on that land had two choices. Option A was to stay in their flimsy wooden houses and hope the invading army was just passing through on a sightseeing tour, which, spoiler alert, they never were. Option B was to disappear. And since invisibility cloaks were in short supply in the 11th century, disappearing meant going down. It wasn't just armies, of course. Sometimes it was just your local lord having a bad day. Maybe his favorite hunting falcon flew off, or his wife, a Habsburg cousin 3 times removed, was looking at him with that distinct family chin, and he needed to vent. The easiest way to vent was to increase taxes on the peasantry. If you had a nice barn on the surface, the tax collector could see it. He could count your chickens. He could estimate the yield of your grain. But if you had a secret dugout hidden in the woods, covered with branches and moss, where you kept your actual good grain and maybe the one pig you didn't want the bishop to know about, well, that was a different story. Underground was, in a very real sense, an offshore tax haven for the serf class. So, the motivation was clear. The surface world was loud, violent, expensive, and generally terrifying. The underground world was quiet, dark, damp, and smelled faintly of mildew. It was an easy choice, really. Let's float over to Central Europe for a moment, specifically the regions that are now Germany and Austria, to look at some of the earliest and strangest examples of this impulse to just get away from it all. We need to talk about something called an Erdstall. It's a German word that roughly translates to Erdstalls, or earth stable, which is a suspiciously normal name for something that is objectively deeply weird. There are hundreds of these things hidden beneath the countryside in Bavaria and Austria. They aren't mines. They aren't really cellars in the traditional sense, because they often aren't connected to a house above ground. They are just tunnels. Very, very small tunnels. And when I say small, I don't mean cozy. I mean claustrophobic on a level that makes a modern MRI machine look like a ballroom. The average Erdstall is maybe 1 meter high and half a meter wide. You can't stand up in them. You can barely crawl in them. You have to sort of shimmy on your stomach, like a very depressed worm. They were dug out by hand in the High Middle Ages, roughly between the 10th and 13th centuries. And the most baffling thing about them, the thing that keeps archaeologists awake at night, which is saying something, since archaeologists love old dirt, is that nobody has any firm idea what they were actually for. They weren't for storage. We know this because the air circulation down there is terrible. If you put a sack of grain in an Erdstall, it would be a fuzzy green science experiment within a week. They weren't for living in, obviously, unless your spine was made of cartilage and you didn't require oxygen. The prevailing theory, and the one that fits our general vibe tonight, is that they were hideouts of the absolute last resort. They were panic rooms designed by people with profound anxiety disorders. Imagine the scenario. The Magyars are coming over the hill on horseback, looking for things to burn. You grab your family, run into the woods, lift up a cleverly disguised trapdoor hidden beneath a fake tree stump, and slide down into the darkness. And then you wait. You wait in the absolute pitch black, lying on your stomach in the damp clay, listening to the muffled sounds of your village being dismantled upstairs. You can't move because if you do, you'll bump into your Uncle Gerald, whose feet are currently in your face because the tunnel is only wide enough for one person at a time. The design of these tunnels seems engineered specifically to maximize discomfort. They aren't straight. They twist and turn at sharp 90-degree angles. They change elevation constantly. You'll be crawling along level, and suddenly the floor just drops away 2 feet, or you have to squeeze upward through a hole barely big enough for your shoulders. Historians call these schlups, or slip holes. The idea was tactical. If an enemy soldier found the entrance and decided to crawl in after you, which would require a massive amount of dedication on their part, they would have to squeeze through these tiny pinch points head first. This put the intruder at a distinct disadvantage, especially if you were waiting on the other side of the schlup with a heavy rock or a pointed stick. It was medieval guerrilla warfare at its most intimate. But think about the psychology required to build one of these things. You aren't building a fortress. You are pre-digging your own grave and hoping you only have to stay in it for a few days. The construction process itself must have been maddeningly slow. You couldn't use a pickaxe because there wasn't enough room to swing it. You were probably using small hand spades, sometimes made of iron, sometimes just wood tipped with metal. You were chipping away at dense clay or sandstone, inch by agonizing inch. And what did you do with the dirt? You couldn't just dump it outside the front door, because a giant pile of fresh earth is basically a neon sign pointing to your secret hideout. You had to bag it up, drag it backwards out of the tunnel. Remember, you're on your stomach, and then scatter it far away in the forest at night so nobody would notice the landscape changing. It was an immense amount of labor for a space you sincerely hoped you never had to use. It's the ultimate architectural expression of pessimism. Sometimes, they didn't even stop at just one level. Some Erdstalls have multiple floors connected by vertical shafts. You'd crawl 50 feet, reach a dead end, look up, and see a hole in the ceiling that you had to climb up into to access the next level of misery. Because apparently, if you were going to hide in a hole in the ground, you might as well make it a multi-story complex. Why not double down on the claustrophobia? There's a theory that some of these might have a spiritual purpose, some kind of symbolic rebirth ritual where you crawl into Mother Earth and come out renewed. But honestly, knowing what we know about medieval life, it seems much more likely that they were just terrified of the local duke's mercenaries. Given the choice between a symbolic rebirth and not being stabbed with a pike, most peasants chose the latter. We find these types of refuges all over. It wasn't just a German pastime. In France, they have similar structures called souterrains. Same basic concept, hideouts dug into the soft limestone or clay, usually beneath a farm or a village. During the 100 Years' War, which, as the name implies, went on for quite a while and was generally unpleasant for everyone involved who wasn't a king, these souterrains became vital. The French versions were sometimes a little bit more practical than the cramped German wormholes. They often had chambers big enough to stand up in, which must have felt like unbelievable luxury. Some even had ventilation shafts disguised on the surface, maybe hidden inside a thick hedgerow or popping up in the middle of a briar patch where nobody would look too closely. They thought about the details. They had to. Some of these French hideouts had specific features designed to trick attackers. They would dig false tunnels that led to nowhere, or worse, led to a sudden pitfall trap. Imagine being an English soldier in the 14th century. You're far from home, it's raining, and you've been ordered to search a muddy field for peasants. You find a hole. You climb down, torch in hand. You follow a tunnel for 20 feet, turn a corner, and suddenly the floor isn't there anymore, and you drop 10 feet into a pool of stagnant water. Meanwhile, the family you were looking for is sitting quietly in a different chamber 20 feet away, listening to you splash around and probably using some very colorful medieval French language. It was a grim game of cat and mouse, played out entirely in the dark, underneath the roots of the trees. But this impulse to dig wasn't limited to the peasantry. Sometimes, even the people in the castles got tired of the view. We usually think of castles as the ultimate defense. Thick walls, high towers, boiling oil, the works. But if you were a minor noble whose castle wasn't exactly top tier, or if you had really annoyed a neighbor who owned a trebuchet, sometimes the castle walls just felt like a very large target. There are instances of lesser nobility, people who were technically elites but still far down the food chain from the actual royalty, deciding that a bunker was safer than a battlement. Let's slide over to the British Isles for a moment, where the weather already makes you want to hide indoors anyway. Throughout Scotland and Ireland, there are thousands of things called souterrains, or locally known as fogus, in Cornwall, or earth houses, in Scotland. These date back way before the medieval period, into the Iron Age, but they were used and reused right through the Middle Ages because a good hole in the ground never really goes out of style. These weren't just dirt tunnels. These were often lined with massive stone slabs. It was dry stone construction, meaning no mortar. They just stacked rocks so cleverly that the ceiling didn't collapse on your head. Usually. It required a tremendous amount of effort to move these stones and set them in place underground. You have to wonder about the town meetings where they decided this was the best use of everyone's time. Okay everyone, the harvest is in, and instead of resting, we're going to spend the next 6 months moving granite boulders into a muddy trench. Any objections? No? Good. Some historians think these might have been used for cold storage originally. A place to keep cheese and butter cool in the summer. Which is a nice thought. It's very pastoral. But inevitably, when the Vikings showed up in their longships looking for souvenirs, the butter was quickly moved out, and the people moved in. It's hard to enjoy a nice aged cheddar when a Norseman is trying to set fire to your thatched roof. The prevalence of these underground structures really drives home a fundamental truth about the past that we often forget when watching movies with shiny armor and heroic charges. For the vast majority of people, life wasn't about glory. It was about avoidance. It was about staying out of the way of the people with the shiny armor. And if that meant living like a badger for 3 weeks out of the year, then you grabbed a shovel and you started digging. Because the alternative was dealing with surface politics, and nobody had the energy for that. The competitive geology of siege warfare. So, we've talked about the people hiding in the mud. The introverts of the medieval world, if you will. But digging wasn't just a defensive strategy for terrified peasants. It was also a favorite pastime of the people trying to kill them. You see, if you were a king in the Middle Ages, you had a problem. Your enemies kept building walls. And not just polite garden fences, but massive, stone-clad, distinctively untoppable walls designed specifically to ruin your summer campaign season. You could try to climb over them with ladders, but that usually resulted in your soldiers getting a face full of hot sand or something equally unpleasant. You could try to knock them down with a trebuchet, but that took weeks and the aim was never quite right. So, naturally, the solution was to grab a shovel and go under. This brings us to the fascinating, damp, and incredibly dangerous profession of the military miner, or sapper. These weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They didn't wear shining armor. They didn't ride white horses. They were essentially militarized construction workers who spent their entire deployment staring at the root systems of various turnips. The logic of medieval mining was simple but elegant. A castle wall is heavy. It relies on the ground beneath it to stay upright. If you remove the ground gravity, which was one of the few laws medieval kings actually respected, would do the rest. The process went like this. You would start digging a tunnel far enough away from the castle that the archers on the walls couldn't quite reach you. You dig a long, narrow gallery straight toward the corner of the enemy's keep. As you dug, you had to prop up the roof of your tunnel with wooden beams. This was crucial. You didn't want the tunnel to collapse on you. You wanted it to collapse on the castle later. So, you built a temporary wooden structure underground, essentially holding up the massive weight of the stone tower above. Once you had excavated a large enough cavern directly beneath the tower's foundation, you filled that cavern with everything flammable you could find. Straw, brushwood, dried peat, and, if you were feeling particularly spiteful, dead animals to really make the smoke intolerable. Then, you set it on fire and ran away. As the wood burned, the supports would weaken. Eventually, the beams would snap, the roof of the tunnel would cave in, the ground would sink, and the mighty stone tower above, having lost its footing, would come crashing down in a cloud of dust and masonry. It was slow. It was tedious. It was basically geology weaponized by arson. And nobody loved this tactic more than King John of England. We have to talk about John. If you've heard of him, it's probably because he was the villain in the Robin Hood stories, or because the barons hated him so much they forced him to sign the Magna Carta. He was generally considered a disaster of a human being, paranoid, petty, and prone to tantrums. But he was surprisingly good at knocking things down. In 1215, right after he signed that pesky Magna Carta and immediately decided to ignore it, a group of rebels took over Rochester Castle. Rochester was a beast of a fortress. It had a massive stone keep, 12 feet thick in places. It was designed to be impregnable. John showed up and was, frankly, offended that anyone would dare lock a door against him. He tried the usual stuff first, battering rams, throwing rocks. It didn't work. So, he decided to dig. We actually have the receipt for this operation, which is one of those delightful bureaucratic details that survives from the Middle Ages. John sent a letter to his justiciar in Canterbury with a very specific shopping list. He didn't ask for more swords. He didn't ask for more knights. He wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Send me pickaxes. Send me shovels. And send me 40 of the fattest pigs you can find, and make sure they are not good for eating." 40 pigs. Not for a barbecue. For structural engineering. John's miners dug a tunnel under the southeast corner of the massive keep. They propped it up with timber. And then they brought in the pigs. They slaughtered them and used their rendered fat, basically bacon grease, to slather the wooden beams. Pig fat burns hot. It burns slowly. And it smells distinct. So, picture the scene. The rebel knights are trapped inside the tower. They're hungry, they're tired, and suddenly the floor starts to get warm. Then they smell roasting pork. And then, with a groan that must have felt like the earth itself was complaining about King John's leadership, the entire corner of the castle collapsed. The rebels actually didn't surrender immediately. They just retreated to the other half of the keep because the internal walls were so thick they could still hold out. John had to go in and finish the job manually. But he had made his point. No wall is safe if you have enough shovels and enough pigs. But here is where it gets really psychologically interesting. If you were the guys inside the castle, you knew this was happening. You couldn't see them digging, but sometimes, if you pressed your ear to the cold stone floor of the cellar, you could hear them. Scrape. 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 It's the stuff of nightmares. You're sitting in your safe fortress, and slowly, inevitably, the ground is being stolen from beneath your feet. So, what do? You countermine. This is where medieval warfare turns into a bizarre underground game of Marco Polo. The defenders would start digging their own tunnel from inside the castle, trying to intercept the attacker's tunnel before they could set the fire. They relied on acoustics. They would sometimes place bowls of water on the ground in the cellar, and watch for ripples caused by the vibrations of the enemy pickaxes. If the water in the bowl on the left shivered, you dug left. Imagine the moment of interception. You're a sapper for the King of France. You've been crawling in the dark for 3 weeks, breathing bad air, Your knees are bleeding, and you're covered in clay. Suddenly, your pickaxe breaks through a wall of dirt, and you are face to face with a sapper from the Duke of Burgundy. It wasn't a grand battle. There was no room to swing a sword. You can't do a heroic lunge in a 3-foot-high tunnel. These underground skirmishes were nasty, intimate brawls involving knives, sharpened shovels, and sometimes just throwing dirt in the other guy's eyes. Sometimes, the defenders would break into the attacker's tunnel and just release a swarm of bees. Or throw in a pot of burning sulfur to smoke them out. Chemical warfare in a broom closet. There's a famous story from the siege of St. Andrew's Castle in Scotland in the 1540s. A bit later than our period, but the tech hadn't changed much. The attackers dug a mine. The defenders dug a countermine. But they missed each other. The tunnels passed within a few feet of one another in the dark, and they kept going. The attackers eventually realized they were lost and had to turn back. You can visit these tunnels today. You can see the jagged marks of the tools on the rock. It's a monument to a lot of wasted effort and a lack of GPS. But let's drift back to the peasants for a moment, because while kings were using tunnels to destroy castles, ordinary people were still just trying to find a place to put their turnips where the kings wouldn't find them. In some parts of France, specifically in Picardy, entire underground cities evolved. These weren't just simple hideouts anymore. They were subterranean communities. The Nauers underground city is a prime example. It was huge. It had 28 galleries and about 300 rooms. It was basically a medieval apartment complex carved out of the limestone. It wasn't just a place to hide for an hour. People lived down there for weeks at a time during the worst of the wars. And because humans are humans, they needed infrastructure. They dug chapels underground so they could still go to church. They dug stables for their cattle. They dug bakeries with chimneys that filtered the smoke out through the forest floor above, dispersing it so it wouldn't give away their position. They even had a system of discipline. We found inscriptions on the walls down there. Names, dates, little prayers. And evidence of administration. Just because you're living in a hole doesn't mean you can be rude to your neighbors. The air quality must have been horrific. Imagine 300 people, 50 cows, and a few goats, all sharing the same unventilated air supply 30 meters underground. The smell would have been a physical barrier. But it was safe. Or safe-ish. There's something deeply ironic about the fact that while the nobility were building higher and higher towers to show off their power, the people who actually made the society function were building deeper and deeper holes just to survive that power. The kings looked up at the sun, the people looked at the chalk and the clay. And sometimes, the underground life created its own weird little microeconomies. If you were the guy who knew how to dig a tunnel that didn't collapse, you were suddenly the most popular guy in the village. You were the architect of survival. It wasn't glamorous work. You spent your life bent double, coughing up dust, probably developing chronic back problems by age 20. But in a world where success usually meant not dying of the plague or a sword wound, the ability to disappear into the earth was a superpower. Let's take a moment to appreciate the darkness down there. We are used to light pollution. We are used to streetlights and glowing screens. But inside a medieval dugout, when the single tallow candle burned out, the darkness was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating weight. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. You lost track of time. Day and night became meaningless concepts. You just existed in the cool, damp silence, waiting for the vibrations of horses' hooves on the roof to stop. It was sensory deprivation as a lifestyle choice. And yet they decorated. In some of these souterrains you find carvings. Rough little faces scratched into the wall. Crosses. Symbols to ward off evil spirits. Because even if you were hiding from the English army, you still had to worry about goblins. The medieval mind had a lot of things to worry about, and the underground had its own set of supernatural tenets. They believed that demons lived under the earth. So, by digging these tunnels, they were technically moving into a bad neighborhood. They were putting themselves closer to hell to escape the hell on earth. A rock in a hard place, quite literally. But they kept digging. Generation after generation. The tools got slightly better, Iron spades replaced wooden ones, but the mud stayed the same. The fear stayed the same. And thanks to their paranoia, we have these incredible time capsules today. Empty, silent corridors winding beneath the fields of Europe, waiting for inhabitants who are long gone. In the next part, we're going to explore what happened when people decided that living underground wasn't enough. They wanted to be buried there, too, in style. We'll look at the crypts, the catacombs, and the royal obsession with rotting in private. But for now, just imagine the sound of a shovel hitting soft clay. Thud. 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 A slow, rhythmic heartbeat in the dark. The VIP lounge of the underworld. So, we've covered the peasants shivering in their muddy tubes, and we've covered the soldiers trying to collapse castles with bacon grease. But there was another group of people who were absolutely obsessed with going underground. In fact, they spent their entire lives planning for it. They saved up for it. They wrote detailed instructions about it. I am talking, of course, about the dead. Or, more specifically, the wealthy dead. You see, in the medieval mindset, the underground wasn't just a place to hide or a place to mine salt. It was also the waiting room. And if you were a king, a queen, or just a generic noble with too much money and a fear of purgatory, you didn't want to wait just anywhere. You wanted the VIP section. Technically, this is called a crypt. But let's be honest, it's a basement. A very fancy, consecrated basement. The obsession with being buried under something is kind of interesting when you think about it. The peasants were usually buried outside, in the churchyard, under the grass. It was airy. It was natural. But the elites? No. They wanted to be under the floorboards. The closer you could get your corpse to the altar of the church, the better your chances were supposed to be in the afterlife. It was a proximity-based system. If you were under the high altar, you were basically flying first class. If you were by the door, you were in economy plus. And if you were outside in the rain, well, good luck with the whole salvation thing. This created a massive logistical headache for medieval architects. Because every time a rich patron died, they wanted to be shoved into the foundation of the local cathedral. Imagine you are a stonemason in the 12th century. You've just finished building a beautiful, heavy stone church. The mortar is barely dry. And then the local duke rolls up, or rather, is rolled up in a box, and his widow says, "He needs to go right there. Under the choir stalls. Start digging." Digging a hole inside a building that is already standing is a nightmare. You have to pull up the flagstones, which are heavy. You have to dig down into the earth, hoping you don't hit the water table or, worse, a previous duke who was buried there 50 years ago and has been forgotten. And you have to do all this while the monks are trying to sing their daily prayers upstairs. Chant, chant, chant. Clang of shovel hitting rock. Muffled curse word. Chant, chant, chant. It was a delicate ecosystem. And let's talk about the smell. We have a romanticized view of old cathedrals as smelling like incense and beeswax. And they did. But they also smelled like, well, like a lot of decomposing nobility. Because the seal on these underground crypts wasn't always perfect. There are records of church services being cut short because the vapors, rising from the floor, were making the choir boys pass out. It gives a whole new meaning to the phrase, the odor of sanctity. Sometimes it was just the odor of Uncle Henry. But nobody committed to the underground lifestyle quite like the Habsburgs. We have to talk about the Habsburgs again. I know I mentioned them earlier, but they really are the gift that keeps on giving. This was a family that dominated Europe for centuries, largely by marrying their own cousins and having chins that could open soda cans. They loved a good crypt. But they had a problem. They were so important, and they ruled so many different places, that one grave just wasn't enough. They wanted to be everywhere at once. So, they developed a tradition that is both fascinating and deeply gross. They split up. When a Habsburg emperor died, he didn't just go into one hole. He went into 3. His body would go to the imperial crypt under the Capuchin church in Vienna. This is a metal lover's dream. It's full of these massive, elaborate pewter and bronze sarcophagi. Some of them are the size of a minivan. They have skulls wearing crowns, weeping angels, lions, it's very dramatic. But his heart? His heart would be cut out, put in a silver urn, and sent to the Augustinian church, just a few blocks away. They have a special heart crypt there. Just shelves and shelves of silver jars containing the most important cardiac muscle in the Holy Roman Empire. And his intestines? Yes, they kept those too. The internal organs were removed, put in a copper urn, and sent to St. Stephen's Cathedral. So, to bury one guy, you needed 3 different holes in the ground in 3 different basements. It was a logistical triumph of distribution. If you visit the Imperial Crypt in Vienna today, and you should, it's very quiet and cool, you can see the evolution of royal egos just by looking at the coffins. The early ones are simple. Here lies a guy. He was okay. Then you get to the Baroque period, and suddenly the coffins are exploding with statues. There's Emperor Charles VI. His sarcophagus has a skull on it wearing the Holy Roman crown. Because even in death, he needed you to know he was the boss. And then, right in the middle of all this bronze pomp, there's a simple copper coffin for Joseph II. Joseph was a reformer. He hated waste. He actually tried to pass a law making everyone in Austria get buried in reusable coffins, essentially a box with a trapdoor in the bottom so you could drop the body in the grave and take the box back for the next guy. The people hated it. They rioted. They wanted their own boxes. So Joseph had to cancel the law. But when he died, he insisted on a plain, unadorned coffin. It sits there today, looking like a shoebox next to his parents' massive, over-the-top monuments. It's the most passive-aggressive architectural statement in history. But let's drift away from the emperors and look at what happened when the underground got too full. Because that was a real problem. In a medieval city you have walls. You can't just expand the graveyard whenever you want. Space is finite. But people kept dying. It was one of the few things they were really consistent at. So, what do you do when the churchyard is full? You dig them up. This brings us to the charnel house, or the ossuary. This was the ultimate medieval recycling program. After a body had been in the ground for a few years, long enough for the messy parts to go away and just leave the clean, dry bones, the gravedigger would dig it up. He'd take the bones, maybe give them a nice wash, hopefully, and then stack them in a crypt or a special building. This made room in the graveyard for the new dead people. It was a rotation system. Like crop rotation, but with your ancestors. Some places got really creative with this. If you go to Sedlec in the Czech Republic, or the Capuchin crypt in Rome, you can see what happens when monks get bored and have too many spare ribs lying around. They started decorating. I don't mean they'd put the bones in nice piles. I mean they made chandeliers out of hip bones. They made coats of arms out of clavicles. They made garlands out of skulls. In Rome, the Capuchin friars created a series of underground chapels entirely decorated with the skeletons of their deceased brothers. You walk down there, and it's just walls of bones. Thousands of them. There are mummified monks standing in niches, wearing their robes, looking like they're just pausing for a moment of reflection that has lasted 300 years. And there's a sign. A plaque that reads, "What you are now, we used to be. What we are now, you will be." It's meant to be a profound memento mori, a reminder of death. But it's delivered with a level of interior design flair that is honestly impressive. Someone had to stand there and decide. You know what this archway needs? More femurs. Definitely more femurs. It's macabre, sure. But it's also strangely practical. They were solving a storage problem with art. Now, constructing these spaces required a very specific kind of knowledge. You weren't just digging a hole, you were building a reverse cathedral. The crypts had to support the weight of the massive stone pillars above. This meant the columns in the crypt had to align perfectly with the columns in the main church. If you messed up the alignment by 6 inches, the whole cathedral could come crashing down on your head while you were trying to polish a bishop's tomb. The masons who worked down there spent their days in torchlight, breathing stone dust. It was cool in the summer, which was nice, but it was freezing in the winter. And it was always quiet. There's a specific kind of silence in a crypt. It's heavy. The stone absorbs sound. You don't hear the birds. You don't hear the wind. You just hear the shuffling of feet and the dripping of water. Water was the enemy. If you dig down, water wants to come in. Many crypts were constantly flooding. Winchester Cathedral in England is a great example. It was built on a marsh basically. The crypt was always flooding. In the early 20th century, the whole cathedral was about to sink into the mud. They had to call in a deep-sea diver. A man named William Walker. He spent 6 years working in pitch-black water in the flooded crypt, placing bags of concrete by hand to shore up the foundations. Imagine that job. You aren't in the ocean. You're in the flooded basement of a medieval church, surrounded by the tombs of Saxon kings, working by touch because the water is so murky with peat and mud. He saved the cathedral. But for 6 years, his world was just wet stone and darkness. A true heir to the medieval sappers we talked about earlier. But not all underground spaces were for the dead. Some were for the very, very hard-working living. We need to talk about salt. In the Middle Ages, salt was everything. It preserved your food. It kept you alive through the winter. It was white gold. And to get it, you had to go deep. The Wieliczka salt mine in Poland is one of those places that defies logic. It started operating in the 13th century and didn't stop until 2007. Medieval miners went down there with pickaxes and lamps. And they just kept going. They carved out hundreds of kilometers of tunnels. But they didn't just carve tunnels. They carved a life. Because it took so long to get up and down the shafts, at first, they were using horse-drawn winches. Or just really long ladders. The miners spent huge amounts of time underground. So, naturally, they started carving statues. They carved chapels. They carved chandeliers out of rock salt crystals. There is a cathedral down there, the Chapel of St. Kinga. It is 100 meters underground. Everything in it is made of salt. The floor, which looks like tile, is carved into the solid salt rock. The altar is salt. The relief carvings on the walls, recreating Da Vinci's Last Supper, are salt. It's incredibly beautiful and incredibly fragile. If the ventilation fails and the humidity goes up, the statues start to melt. The horses lived down there too. Once a horse was lowered into the mine, it usually stayed there. They had stables carved out of salt. The air was actually quite healthy, very salty, obviously, which is good for the lungs. They didn't have the same respiratory problems as coal miners. But imagine the life of a horse that never sees the sun. Or the life of a miner who wakes up before dawn, goes down into the dark, works all day by the light of a flickering lamp, and comes up after sunset. For them, the surface world was a dream. The real world was gray, salty, and echoey. It creates a different kind of culture. A culture of superstition. Miners are notoriously superstitious. They believed in the treasurer, a spirit who guarded the salt. If you were good and respectful, he'd warn you before a collapse. If you were loud or whistled in the mine, he'd blow out your lamp and leave you in the dark. And being left in the dark in a mine is not like being in a dark room. It is absolute. You can't tell if your eyes are open or closed. So, whether you were a king trying to secure your spot in heaven by burying your heart in a jar, or a miner trying to extract enough salt to buy bread, the underground was a place of intense focus. It stripped away the distractions of the surface. No birds, no weather, no changing seasons. Just rock. And work. And waiting. There's something very calming about that, in a weird way. The earth doesn't care about your deadlines. It doesn't care about your social status, although the Habsburgs tried their best to make it care. The earth just sits there, heavy and patient. In the next part, we're going to look at the people who didn't want to be found. Not the peasants hiding for a few days, but the people who built secret societies, hidden temples, and illicit meeting spots beneath the bustling streets of medieval cities. We'll crawl into the secret tunnels of the Templars and the hidden passageways of paranoid popes. But for now, just picture those salt miners, carving a chandelier out of rock, knowing that the only people who would ever see it were the other guys stuck in the dark with them. Let's take a breath and let the dust settle. The secret highways of the paranoid elite. Welcome back to the underground. We've spent some time with the peasants shivering in their dirt tunnels, and we've hung out with the dead Habsburgs in their triple occupancy crypts. But tonight, we need to talk about a different kind of subterranean enthusiast. We need to talk about the people who had everything: money, power, fancy hats, but still felt the overwhelming urge to travel below the surface. You see, in the Middle Ages, the streets were not a safe space for the 1%. They were crowded, they were dirty, and they were full of people who might have legitimate grievances about the tax rate. If you were a high-ranking official, a wealthy banker, or a Knight Templar, walking down the main street was just asking for trouble. It was inefficient. You had to dodge carts, livestock, and beggars. So, the logical solution was to build your own private highway system. A VIP lane, carved out of rock, where you could move your assets, and yourself, without ever having to make eye contact with the public. Let's drift over to the city of Acre, on the coast of modern-day Israel. In the 12th and 13th centuries, this was a Crusader city, a major hub for trade and, naturally, for the Knights Templar. Now, the Templars have a reputation for being mysterious warrior monks who guarded the Holy Grail and maybe invented conspiracy theories. But in reality, their day-to-day job was much more boring. They were bankers. They were essentially an armored logistics company. They had a lot of gold, and they had to move it from the port to their fortress. The distance wasn't huge, maybe 350 meters. But in a busy medieval port city, carrying chests of gold through the souk was a logistical nightmare. It was slow, and it was dangerous. So they dug. They built what is now known as the Templar Tunnel. It was discovered by accident in 1994 by a plumber who was just trying to fix a clogged drain. Because that's how history usually works, not with a grand expedition, but with a guy named Dave trying to fix a toilet. The tunnel is fascinating because it is purely utilitarian. It connects the Templar fortress on the west side of the city directly to the port on the east. It runs through the solid bedrock. The construction is surprisingly high-end. The lower part of the tunnel is carved from the natural rock, but the upper part is a barrel vault built of hewn stone. It's comfortable. You can walk upright in it. It's not like the peasant crawl spaces we talked about earlier. Imagine being a Templar knight. You've just arrived on a ship from France. You have a chest of silver coins intended to pay for a new castle wall. Instead of fighting your way through the crowds, you step off the boat, open a nondescript door, and walk into the cool, damp silence of the tunnel. 350 meters of quiet walking. No sun, no noise. Just the sound of your boots on the stone. You pop up inside the fortress, deposit the cash, and nobody even knew you were there. It was the medieval equivalent of a pneumatic tube at a drive-through bank. But it wasn't just the Templars who liked to keep a low profile. Let's float over to England, specifically to the city of Nottingham. Nottingham is famous for the sheriff and Robin Hood, but it should be famous for its geology. The city is built on a ridge of sandstone that is soft enough to be carved with hand tools but hard enough not to collapse. It's essentially the structural equivalent of a very stale biscuit. Because the ground was so easy to work with, the people of Nottingham didn't just build on the land, they built into it. There are over 800 documented caves beneath the city streets. Everyone had a cave. If you bought a house in medieval Nottingham, the first thing you did was check the basement, because the basement probably went down 3 stories. These weren't just for storage. These were workshops. The tanners used them. Tanning leather is a disgusting process. It involves soaking animal hides in urine and dog feces for weeks to soften them up. It smells exactly as bad as you imagine it does. If you do that on the street, your neighbors will throw rocks at you. But if you dig a cave 30 feet down and do it there, the smell stays, mostly, underground. There were also malt kilns for brewing beer. In fact, one of the oldest pubs in England, Ye Old Trip to Jerusalem, is built right into the sandstone cliff beneath Nottingham Castle. The rooms are just caves. The temperature down there is constant year-round, which is perfect for storing ale. So you had a city where the industry was literally happening beneath your feet. You could be walking to the market, and 10 feet below you, a guy was soaking a cow hide in a vat of ammonia, and 20 feet below him, someone was tapping a keg of ale. It was a layered lasagna of commerce. But the most interesting use of these caves brings us back to the darker side of medieval life: imprisonment. Nottingham Castle has a famous dungeon known as King David's Dungeon, named after David II of Scotland, who was allegedly held there in the 14th century. Now usually, when we think of dungeons, we think of iron bars. But in a sandstone city, a dungeon is just a hole shaped like a bottle. You dig a shaft down, then widen it out at the bottom. You lower the prisoner in on a rope, pull the rope up, and put a grate over the hole. There is no lock to pick. There is no door to kick down. You are just sitting in a stone jug in the dark. We've found carvings on the walls of these oubliettes, from the French oublier, to forget. Because that was the point. You put someone down there, and you forgot them. The carvings are intricate. Crosses, calvaries, even geometric patterns. It speaks to the immense amount of free time these prisoners had. They were sitting in absolute darkness, running their fingers over the soft sandstone, scratching out their prayers inch by inch. It's a sobering thought. While the king was upstairs in the great hall eating roast swan, a king from Scotland was potentially sitting 30 feet below him, carving a cross into the wall with a spoon. But let's move away from prisons and talk about something even more pressing for the medieval elite: water. And the paranoia that comes with it. If you are a pope in the Middle Ages, you have a lot of enemies. The Holy Roman Emperor probably hates you. The local Roman families hate you. The French king wants to kidnap you. It's a stressful job. So, popes often spent their time hiding in hill towns, specifically Orvieto. Orvieto is a beautiful city in Italy that sits on top of a massive volcanic rock. It's a natural fortress. You can't climb the sheer cliffs. But a fortress on a rock has one fatal flaw: it doesn't have a river. If an army surrounds the rock and waits, you eventually run out of water. And dying of thirst is a very undignified way for a pope to go. So, in the 1520s, right at the tail end of our period, but the mindset is purely medieval, Pope Clement VII fled to Orvieto after Rome was sacked. He looked at the water situation and panicked. He commissioned a well. But not just a bucket on a rope. He commissioned an engineering marvel that is purely a product of fear. It's called the Pozzo di San Patrizio, or St. Patrick's Well. And it is terrifyingly deep. It goes down 53 meters, about 175 feet, into the volcanic rock to reach the water table. But the problem with a well that deep is logistics. How do you get enough water up for a whole city? One bucket at a time isn't going to cut it. You need pack animals. You need donkeys carrying water barrels. But you can't have donkeys trying to pass each other on a narrow spiral staircase in the dark. They'll get stubborn, they'll block the path, it'll be a disaster. So, the architect, Antonio da San Gallo the Younger, designed a double helix staircase. It's like the DNA molecule, but made of brick. There are two separate staircases that never meet. The donkeys would go down one staircase, fill up their barrels at the bottom via a bridge over the water, and then walk up the other staircase to the surface. One-way traffic. 4 donkeys. Underground. The windows are cut into the central shaft so you can look across and see the other staircase, but you can't get to it. Imagine the life of those donkeys. Walking in a continuous downward spiral into the cool, damp earth, crossing a bridge in the twilight, and then spiraling back up. Hundreds of times a day. The acoustics in there are bizarre. You can hear a whisper from the bottom all the way at the top. It echoes. Clip, clop, clip, clop. It was a masterpiece of engineering, built entirely because a pope was afraid of being thirsty. And the irony is, by the time it was finished, the pope had died, and the siege never really happened. It stands there today as a monument to expensive anxiety. But not all underground jobs were as clean as fetching water or moving gold. We have to talk about the absolute bottom rung of the ladder. The people who worked in the underground that nobody wanted to acknowledge existed. The gong farmers. In medieval cities, plumbing was primitive. Most people used a cesspit. A hole in the ground in the backyard, or sometimes in the basement, where everything went. Eventually, the hole gets full. And someone has to empty it. That someone was the gong farmer. Gong was an old word for dumb. These guys were the night shift of the Middle Ages. By law, in cities like London, they were only allowed to work between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. They weren't allowed to live in certain neighborhoods because, frankly, they smelled terrible. They would show up at your house in the middle of the night, open up the cesspit, and climb in. Yes, climb in. They had buckets and shovels. They would scoop out the night soil, fill barrels, and cart it out of the city to be sold as fertilizer. It was dangerous work. The fumes in a sealed cesspit could be lethal. The damp, as they called it, could knock you out, and if you passed out in a cesspit, well, you can imagine the rest. But here is the twist. It was actually a very well-paid job. Because nobody else wanted to do it, the gong farmers could charge a premium. They were the essential workers of the 14th century. A master gong farmer earned as much as a skilled carpenter or a stonemason. And they had perks. By law, anything they found in the cesspit was theirs to keep. Now, you might ask, what could you possibly find in a cesspit that you would want to keep? You'd be surprised. People drop things. Coins, jewelry, silver spoons. If you were a clumsy aristocrat and you dropped your favorite ring down the privy, you weren't going after it. You wrote it off. But the gong farmer, wading through the muck at 3 a.m. with a lantern, would find it. So you have this weird social dynamic where the guys doing the foulest job in the city were actually walking around with silver rings on their fingers, hiding their wealth under their smelly clothes. They were the kings of the underground. They knew the city from the bottom up. They knew which noble houses had rich diets, which meant worse smells, and which ones were struggling. They were the keepers of the city's biological secrets. There's a record of a gong farmer named Richard the Raker, great name, who fell into a cesspit in 1326 and died. The coroner's report is surprisingly detailed. It wasn't treated as a joke. It was a workplace accident. The city recognized that without Richard and his colleagues, the entire surface world would literally drown in its own waste. So, while the Templars were walking through their clean, stone-lined tunnels thinking about compound interest, and the popes were spiraling down their double helix staircases worrying about hydration, the gong farmers were in the muck, keeping the whole system running. It's a reminder that the underground is essentially the subconscious of the city. It's where we put the things we don't want to see. The dead bodies, the sewage, the prisoners, the secret money. We pave over it. We build nice timber-framed houses on top of it. We plant gardens. But underneath, just a few feet down, there is a whole other world of activity. Silent, dark, and smelling faintly of ammonia and damp stone. It's a busy place, the underground. And sometimes people went down there not to hide, or to work, but to find answers. In the next part, we're going to look at the people who believe the underground held magical properties. We'll talk about the alchemists who set up their labs and cellars to avoid blowing up. Their neighbors, and the strange legends of things that were rumored to live deep in the earth, dragons, sleeping kings, and the entrance to purgatory itself. Because if you dig deep enough, eventually you stop hitting dirt and start hitting mythology. But for now, just imagine the gong farmer, carting his barrel out of the city gate as the sun starts to rise. He's tired, he smells awful, but he's got a silver coin in his pocket that he found in the muck. And in the medieval world, that counts as a good night. Let's leave him there, and let the darkness close back in. The basement science of turning lead into disappointment. So, we've covered the people hiding from armies, the people digging for salt, and the people shoveling things we'd rather not mention. But there was another group of people who looked at a damp, dark cellar and saw something else entirely. They saw a laboratory. We need to talk about the alchemists. Now, pop culture loves to paint alchemists as wizards. We imagine them in tall towers, surrounded by lightning, holding flasks of glowing purple liquid. But historically speaking, if you were an alchemist in the 14th century, you didn't want a tower. A tower is visible. A tower attracts the attention of the bishop, who might have some pointed questions about why you're trying to play God with a piece of lead and a crucible. No, the smart alchemists went underground. They were the original basement hobbyists. But instead of model trains, their hobby was trying to break the laws of physics. The nickname for alchemists at the time was puffers, or souffleurs in French. This wasn't a compliment. It was because they spent all their time working the bellows, puffing air into their furnaces to keep the heat up. Imagine the atmosphere in one of these underground labs. It's a cellar in Paris or Prague. There are no windows, obviously, because you don't want the neighbors to see the weird green smoke pouring out of your ventilation shaft. It's hot, unbearably hot, because the furnace has to run 24/7. And it smells. Not like the Gong farmer's workspace, but a different kind of bad. It smells of sulfur, mercury, rotten eggs, and singed eyebrows. The goal, as we all know, was the Philosopher's Stone. The legendary substance that could turn base metals into gold and maybe grant eternal life. It was the ultimate get-rich-quick scheme. But the reality of alchemy was mostly just cooking rocks. You take some mercury, mix it with sulfur, seal it in a glass vessel, and heat it up. Then you'd wait. You'd watch it change color. Oh look, it turned black. That's the Nigredo stage. That's good. Then you'd wait some more. Now it's turning white. The albedo. And then, usually, the glass would crack, the mercury would spill, and you'd have to explain to your wife why the cat is now silver and the basement is on fire. It was a profession of infinite patience and infinite failure. But the secrecy was paramount. If you did manage to find something cool, like, say, how to make phosphorus, which actually glows in the dark, you didn't publish a paper. You hid it. You wrote your notes in code. You used metaphors like the green lion eating the sun to describe chemical reactions so that nobody else could steal your recipe. So, the underground became a library of secrets. Thousands of men sitting in the dark, staring into fires, convinced they were one experiment away from infinite wealth, while slowly poisoning themselves with heavy metal fumes. It's tragic, but also, you have to admire the dedication. But for some, the underground wasn't just a place to hide secrets. It was a doorway. Let's drift over to Ireland, to a place called Station Island on Loch Derg. In the Middle Ages, this was one of the most famous tourist destinations in Christendom. But it wasn't a resort. It was known as St. Patrick's Purgatory. The legend went that Jesus had shown St. Patrick a cave on this island that was a direct entrance to purgatory. Not a metaphor. A literal back door. If you were brave enough, or guilty enough, you could go there. You would fast for 15 days, pray constantly, and then, the monks would lock you in the cave. For 24 hours. They would shut the door, lock it from the outside, and leave you there. In the pitch black. Underground. The idea was that in the darkness, the veil between worlds would thin. You would see visions. You might see the souls of the damned suffering in purgatory. You might see the bridge to paradise. Or, more likely, you would see the result of extreme sensory deprivation, low blood sugar, and high carbon dioxide levels. People flocked to this place. Knights, noblemen, people who had done very bad things and needed a serious spiritual detox. We have accounts written by people who went in. A knight named Owen went in 1153. He claimed he saw fields of punishment, demons with hooks, the whole Dante's Inferno experience before Dante even wrote it. But think about the psychology of the cave itself. It was small. It was cold. You are alone with your own thoughts, which, if you are a medieval knight, probably involve a lot of violence and regret. The underground acts as a mirror. Without the sun to distract you, you are forced to look at yourself. It was therapy, medieval style. Which is to say, it was terrifying, uncomfortable, and involved being locked in a hole. Eventually, the Pope decided this was all getting a bit out of hand and ordered the cave closed in 1497. They smashed it up and filled it in. But the pilgrims kept coming anyway. Because the idea that there is a physical place where you can confront your demons is just too appealing to let go of. But if you weren't looking for purgatory, you might be looking for a king. There is a widespread belief in European folklore known as the king under the mountain. The idea is that the great heroes of the past didn't actually die. They just went underground to take a nap. In Germany, the legend centers on Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. He drowned in a river during the Third Crusade, which is a bit of an anticlimax. So, the people decided, no, that can't be right. He's probably just sleeping. The story goes that he is sitting at a stone table deep inside the Kyffhauser mountain. He's been asleep for so long that his red beard has grown through the table. Every 100 years he wakes up, sends a dwarf, because of course there are dwarves, up to the surface to check if the ravens are still flying around the mountain. If the ravens are there, he sighs, goes back to sleep, and hits the snooze button for another century. It's the ultimate procrastination. He's waiting for the time when Germany needs him most. But apparently, the 30 Years' War, the Black Death, and the World Wars weren't quite urgent enough to get him out of his chair. King Arthur has the same story in Britain. He's sleeping in a cave in Alderley Edge, or maybe in Wales, surrounded by his knights and a lot of treasure. Just waiting. Why do we tell these stories? Why do we put our heroes underground? Maybe it's because the underground feels timeless. On the surface, things rot. Buildings fall down. Trees die. But a cave? A cave stays the same. The temperature never changes. The wind never blows. It feels eternal. If you wanted to preserve something, a body, a treasure, a legend, you put it in the earth. And then, of course, there were the things that were supposed to be down there. The things you didn't want to wake up. Dragons? Or worms, as the medievals often called them. Before paleontology was a science, people would sometimes find massive bones in the earth. Dinosaur bones or mammoth bones. They didn't know what a T-Rex was. So, when they dug up a femur the size of a grown man, they assumed dragon. It made sense. Dragons live underground. They guard gold. They breathe fire, which explains volcanoes. And when they shift in their sleep, the earth shakes, which explains earthquakes. The underground was the realm of monsters. So, every time a miner went down into the pit, or a sapper crawled into a tunnel, they weren't just afraid of a cave-in. They were afraid of waking up something scaly. There are records of miners in Central Europe claiming to see kobolds, little earth spirits. Some were helpful. They'd knock on the walls to show you where the rich ore was. Others were malicious. They'd cut your rope or blow out your light. The chemical element cobalt is actually named after them. The miners found an ore that looked like silver but wouldn't smelt properly and gave off poisonous arsenic fumes. They blamed the kobolds for bewitching the rock. "It's cobalt ore," they said. And the name stuck. So even our modern chemistry table has ghosts in it. This mix of science, religion, and pure terror is what makes the medieval underground so fascinating. It wasn't just dirt. It was a crowded place. It was full of sleeping emperors, suffering souls, invisible demons, poisonous sprites, and guys named Pierre trying to turn lead into gold. It was the subconscious of the entire society. And as we drift towards the end of our journey tonight, it's worth thinking about how little has changed. We still put our most valuable things underground, in bank vaults. We still put our most dangerous things underground, nuclear waste. And we still bury our dead, sealing them away in the quiet dark. But for the medieval person, the barrier between the surface and the depths was much thinner. All it took was a shovel and a bit of bad luck, and you could find yourself in a different world entirely. A world where the sun never rises, where the air is still, and where time stops. So, as you lie there, comfortably above ground, I hope, just imagine the layers beneath you. The pipes, the wires, the old foundations, the fossils, the rock. Deep, silent, and heavy. It's a good place to rest. And that, my friends, is the story of how medieval people built, lived, and dreamed in the dark. Good night. The city that goes down instead of up. Hey guys. We're still here. I know we just said goodnight to the alchemists and the gong farmers. But the thing about history is that just when you think you've hit the bottom, you find a trapdoor that goes down another 8 levels. So, don't fall asleep just yet. Or actually do. That's the point. But keep listening, because we need to talk about the ultimate expression of the I don't want to talk to anyone. architectural style. We discussed the small, cramped Erdstalls in Germany, and the muddy basements of France. Those were cute. They were hobby projects. But if you want to see professional-grade avoidance, you have to go to Turkey. Specifically to the region of Cappadocia. Here, the landscape looks like something from a sci-fi movie cover art from the 1970s. It's full of fairy chimneys, weird, tall rock formations made of soft volcanic tuff. And for thousands of years, people looked at this soft rock and thought, I could definitely live inside that. But in 1963, a man in the town of Derinkuyu was renovating his house. He knocked down a wall in his basement, probably looking for more storage space for his winter coats. Instead, he found a tunnel. He followed the tunnel. It led to a room, which led to another tunnel, which led to a massive stone door. He had accidentally rediscovered the ancient underground city of Derinkuyu. And when I say city, I don't mean a few connected basements. I mean a metropolis carved entirely out of rock that could house 20,000 people. 20,000. That's not a hideout. That's a municipality. That's a place with a mayor and zoning laws. Let's just float down into this place for a moment. It goes down approximately 85 meters. That's about 280 feet. It has 18 distinct levels. Imagine an 18-story skyscraper, but shove it underground, remove all the windows, and make the corridors just narrow enough that you can't walk side by side with anyone you don't really like. The engineering required to build this is mind-boggling. The Hittites started it, the Phrygians expanded it, and the Byzantine Christians really perfected it during the Arab-Byzantine Wars. The main concern, as we discussed with the Pope's well, is always air. If you put 20,000 people and their livestock, yes, they brought the cows, 18 stories underground, the carbon dioxide levels are going to get lethal very quickly. So, they dug over 15,000 ventilation shafts. These weren't just holes poked in the ceiling. These were precise, vertical shafts that went all the way down to the water table, serving double duty as wells and air ducts. The airflow was designed so carefully that even on the deepest levels, the air is still breathable today. It's stale, sure. It smells like old dust. But it won't kill you. The layout of the city is a masterclass in paranoia. The upper levels were for the animals. Why? Because cows are heavy, and you don't want to drag a terrified ox down 18 flights of stairs. Plus, the animals generated heat, creating a layer of insulation for the humans living below. A biological blanket, if you will. As you go deeper, you find the living quarters. Bedrooms. Kitchens. Even wineries. Yes, they made wine underground. Because if you're going to be besieged by an army for 3 months, you're definitely going to need a drink. They found massive stone vats and presses. It seems that survival and happy hour were not mutually exclusive concepts for the Cappadocians. But the security features are where it gets really interesting. The tunnels connecting the levels could be blocked off instantly using massive millstones. These were circular stone doors, weighing up to 500 kilograms. They were shaped like giant donuts. You could roll them shut from the inside, but because of the way the leverage worked, they were impossible to open from the outside. It's the "Do not disturb" sign to end all. Do not disturb signs. Each level could be sealed off individually. So if the enemy breached the first floor, you just rolled the stones shut and retreated to the second floor. If they breached that, you went to the third. It was a defense in depth, played out in slow motion in the dark. They even had communication tubes, small vertical holes connecting the levels so you could yell messages up and down. Hey, level 5, are the invaders gone yet? No, level 8, stop asking. They had a school down there. A large, barrel-vaulted room where students would sit and learn scripture. Imagine being a child in that school. Reciting your lessons by torchlight, hundreds of feet beneath the grass, knowing that the only reason you are down there is because someone upstairs wants to kill you. It's a very intense educational environment. And they had a church. Of course they did. It was shaped like a cross, carved straight out of the rock. The psychological toll of living in Derinkuyu for months at a time must have been immense. We know from modern submarine crews that living without sunlight affects your circadian rhythm, your mood, and your sanity. The people of Derinkuyu didn't have special UV lights. They had oil lamps. The world was perpetually orange and flickering. Shadows were everywhere. And the silence. The rock absorbed sound. Unless you were near the ventilation shaft, it would be dead quiet. Just the sound of your own breathing and the distant mooing of a cow on level 1. But Derinkuyu wasn't the only one. There are over 200 underground cities in this region. Some are connected by tunnels that stretch for miles. It's like an ant farm for humans. Historians think that at certain points in history, the entire population of the region just vanished underground. The surface would look deserted. Crops growing wild, houses empty. But beneath the soil, tens of thousands of people were eating, sleeping, praying, and making wine. It completely subverts our idea of civilization. We think civilization is about building up skyscrapers, monuments, pyramids. We want to be seen. But the Cappadocians decided that civilization was about surviving. And if survival meant becoming a mole person, they were all in. Now, let's shift gears and move geographically and chronologically. We're going to leave the dry volcanic rock of Turkey and head to the damp, wood-paneled manor houses of Elizabethan England. Because digging holes wasn't always about armies. Sometimes it was about religion. In the late 16th century, being a Catholic priest in England was, let's say, a high-risk career choice. It was illegal. If you were caught saying Mass, you could be tortured and executed. But there were still lots of Catholic families who wanted their services. So, they needed a place to hide the priest when the pursuivants, the priest hunters, came knocking. Enter the priest hole. These weren't dugouts in the traditional sense of digging into the ground, although some were. These were architectural magic tricks. They were spaces stolen from the fabric of the house itself. The master of this craft was a man named Nicholas Owen. He was a Jesuit lay brother, and he was a genius. He was also a dwarf, and he had a limp, which makes his career as a builder of secret climbing spaces even more impressive. Nicholas Owen spent his life traveling from one great manor house to another, posing as a wandering carpenter. During the day, he'd fix a wobbly table or repair a staircase. But at night, while everyone else was asleep, he would work on his real project. He would cut through floorboards. He would hollow out thick stone walls. He would create spaces where no space should exist. He built hides under staircases that lifted up on a pivot. He built hides behind false fireplaces. He built hides inside the structural chimneys, so you could be hiding inside the chimney stack while a fire was burning in the hearth below you. He was obsessed with fooling the eye. He would sometimes build a fake priest hole, an obvious cupboard with a false back that was easy to find. The priest hunters would find it, feel clever, shout, "Aha!" and stop searching. Meanwhile, the real priest was hiding in a second, much smaller hole located inside the first hole. It was hide-and-seek inception. The conditions inside a priest hole were horrific. They were tiny. Often, there wasn't room to stand or even sit comfortably. You had to crouch or lie curled up. And you had to stay there for days. There are records of priests hiding for 4, 5, even 10 days while the hunters tore the house apart. The hunters were thorough. They would tap every inch of the wall looking for hollow sounds. They would measure the footprint of the room inside and compare it to the outside to see if there was missing space. They would rip up floorboards. They would count the windows. So the priest, huddled in the dark behind a piece of wainscoting, had to be absolutely silent. He couldn't cough. He couldn't sneeze. He had a small supply of food, maybe a straw to suck broth through a crack, and a hole for waste. Nicholas Owen thought of everything. He masked the sound of hollow walls by packing them with wool. He disguised the trapdoors so perfectly that even today, looking at them with full knowledge of where they are, you can barely see the seams. He saved hundreds of lives. Eventually, he was caught, of course. He was tortured to death in the Tower of London in 1606. But he never gave up the location of a single hide he built. Many of them were only discovered centuries later. Some, presumably, haven't been discovered yet. There is something deeply spooky about standing in an old English manor house today. You look at a wall, and you wonder, is that a wall? Or is that a space where a terrified man sat in the dark in 1590, listening to the boots of soldiers tramping on the floorboards above his head? These spaces, Derinkuyu, the priest's holes, they speak to a very specific human fear. The fear of being hunted. Most architecture is about shelter from the elements. A roof keeps the rain off. Walls keep the wind out. But this underground architecture is about shelter from other humans. It's an admission that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a wolf or a storm. It's a guy with a badge or a sword who disagrees with your theology. And the lengths people went to. Digging 85 meters into volcanic rock. Carving out the inside of a chimney. It shows a stubbornness that is almost inspiring. You can forbid my religion, you can bring an army, you can burn my city. But I'm not leaving. I'm just going into the wall. It's passive resistance through interior design. Let's float back to the idea of the secret. The underground is the keeper of secrets. In the 18th and 19th centuries, smuggling became the great underground profession, especially in coastal towns in England and France. If you visit a town like Hastings or Rye, the locals will tell you that every cellar is connected. They say you could roll a barrel of French brandy from the beach to the church altar without it ever seeing sunlight. Smugglers' tunnels are the stuff of legend. Most of the stories are exaggerated. Digging tunnels is hard work, as we've established, and smugglers were busy people. It was often easier just to bribe the customs officer. But some of them are real. And they are cramped, wet and nasty. They were used to move, oling, smuggled wool, out and brandy tea and lace in. Imagine the scene. A moonless night on the coast. A boat runs ashore. Men in dark coats silently unload heavy barrels. They pry up a flagstone in a nearby tavern. And the goods disappear into the earth. The next day, the customs officer sits in that same tavern, drinking a pint, completely unaware that directly beneath his feet is enough contraband to buy the whole building. It adds a layer of delight to the world, doesn't it? The idea that the surface is just a facade. A polite fiction. The real business, the risky business, happens down in the dark. It's getting late now. Or early. Time is a bit flexible when you're underground. The sun doesn't dictate the schedule down here. We've traveled from the defensive tunnels of peasants to the aggressive mines of kings, from the holy crypts to the salty mines, from the vast cities of Cappadocia to the tiny cupboards of English priests. They all share one thing, the desire to create a space that is entirely your own. A space where the rules of the surface don't apply. In the next part, we're going to look at one final aspect of the underground. We're going to look at the future, or rather, the retro-future. We'll talk about the bunkers. The Cold War anxiety that led us to do exactly what the medieval peasants did. Grab a shovel and start digging in the backyard. Because history is a circle. And apparently that circle goes down. But for now, settle in. Pull the covers up. Imagine you are in a safe, warm, hidden room. No soldiers. No tax collectors. No priest hunters. Just quiet, thick walls and the smell of old stone. You're safe here. Nobody knows where you are. Sleep well. The aristocrat who painted his tunnels pink. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we've spent the last hour or so crawling through the mud with medieval peasants, hiding in chimneys with Tudor priests, and worrying about air quality with Cappadocian winemakers. But now we're going to jump forward a little bit. We're going to leave the Middle Ages behind, but we aren't leaving the shovel behind. Because as history marched on, the urge to go underground didn't disappear. It just got weirder. And much, much more expensive. In the medieval period, you dug a hole because you were afraid of an army. In the Victorian era, you dug a hole because you were socially awkward. We have to talk about William John Cavendish Scott Bentinck, the 5th Duke of Portland. This man is the patron saint of I don't want to see anybody ever. He lived in the mid-19th century at Welbeck Abbey in England. He was incredibly wealthy, incredibly shy, and possibly just a little bit unhinged. He inherited a massive estate, but he had zero interest in the usual aristocratic hobbies like fox hunting or oppressing the locals. Instead, he wanted to be invisible. He fired most of the indoor staff because he didn't want to bump into them in the hallway. If a maid did encounter him by accident, she was instructed to stare at the floor and pretend she didn't exist. If she looked at him, she was fired. But his real passion was construction. He spent the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars digging. He built a tunnel network under his estate that stretched for miles. One tunnel was over a mile long, just so he could walk from his house to the train station without anyone seeing him. And this wasn't a damp, muddy tunnel. It was wide enough for two people to walk abreast. It was lit by skylights during the day and gas lamps at night. It was heated. And, for reasons that only the Duke understood, he had the walls painted pink. Imagine that. You are a gardener at Welbeck Abbey. It's 1860. You're pruning the roses, and beneath your feet, an elderly Duke is walking alone through a mile-long, gaslit, bright pink tube, just to avoid saying, "Good morning." But he didn't stop at tunnels. He decided the house itself was too exposed. So he started building rooms underground. He built a library underground. He built a billiards room underground. And then, he built the ballroom. The Welbeck Underground Ballroom is one of the strangest rooms in England. It is massive, 160 feet long. The ceiling is supported by giant iron arches. It has a hydraulic lift that could lower 20 guests from the surface down into the room. It was fully equipped for the party of the century. But here's the kicker, the Duke never held a ball. Not one. He built a subterranean party palace capable of holding hundreds of people, and he used it to store furniture. He would go down there alone, walk across the empty dance floor, check the gas lights, and then go back to his room. It is the ultimate architectural expression of loneliness. Or maybe just introversion on an unlimited budget. When he died, they found his rooms were almost completely empty of furniture. He had lived in a small suite in the corner of his massive mansion, painted pink, again, with a toilet installed right in the middle of the room, unpartitioned. He was a strange guy. But in a way, he was just continuing the tradition of the medieval elites we talked about earlier. He used the earth as a buffer. A shield against the demands of society. While the Duke was digging his pink tunnels in England, something much grimmer was happening in Paris. We can't do a history of the underground without visiting the Paris Catacombs. This is the moment where city planning meets a horror movie. In the late 18th century, Paris had a problem. Its cemeteries were overflowing. Literally. The Saints Innocents Cemetery was so full that the ground level had risen 10 feet above the street. The smell was reportedly so bad it could curdle milk. And then, in 1780, the basement wall of a restaurant next to the cemetery collapsed due to the pressure of the earth, and the contents of the cemetery spilled into the poor restaurateur's cellar. I will spare you the details, but let's just say it was not a good day for the soup of the day. The city decided enough was enough. They needed to move the bones. But where? Well, Paris sits on top of massive limestone deposits. The city had been mining this stone for centuries to build, well, Paris. So, beneath the streets, there were hundreds of miles of empty, abandoned mine tunnels. So they started the Great Migration of the Dead. For years, every night, covered wagons draped in black cloth would rumble through the streets of Paris, carrying bones from the cemeteries to the mine shafts. They dumped them down the wells. At first, it was just a pile of bones. But then, an inspector named Heracart de Thury decided that was disrespectful and messy. So he ordered the bones to be stacked. Artistically. If you go to the catacombs today, you see the result of his vision. Walls made of femurs. Heart shapes made of skulls. Pillars made of tibias. It holds the remains of 6 million people. It is a city of the dead, mirroring the city of the living above. But the catacombs are dangerous. They are a maze. And unlike the Duke of Portland's tunnels, they are not lit by gas lamps. There is a famous story, a true one, of a man named Philibert Espert. In 1793, During the height of the French Revolution, Philibert was the doorkeeper at the Val de Grace Hospital. One night, he decided to go into the catacombs. Maybe he was looking for the legendary secret stash of chartreuse liqueur that the monks were rumored to have hidden down there. Maybe he was just curious. He took a candle. He went down a staircase. And he never came back. They didn't find him for 11 years. When they finally found him, he was just a skeleton, identifiable only by the keys to the hospital hanging from his belt. He was only a few hundred yards from an exit. But in the dark, without a light, a few hundred yards is infinity. They buried him right where they found him. You can still see his tombstone down there today. It's a sobering reminder. The underground doesn't care who you are. If you lose your light, you stay. But the 19th century wasn't just about hiding bones or dukes. It was also about travel. We have to talk about the London Underground. Because we take subways for granted now. You swipe your card, you get on the train, you ignore the weird smell. But when they first proposed building a railway underground in the 1860s, people thought it was literal madness. The clergy preached against it. They said that by digging that deep, workers would break into hell. They were genuinely concerned that a commuter train would accidentally run over the devil. And honestly, the early experience wasn't far off. The first trains were steam engines. Let that sink in. Steam engines burn coal. They produce smoke. Lots of smoke. Now, put a steam engine in a tunnel. The early London Underground was a sulphurous nightmare. The stations were filled with smog. Passengers would come out coughing up black soot. The travel guides of the time advised men to grow beards to act as natural air filters for the coal dust. They had blowholes, vents in the street to let the smoke out. If you were walking past one when a train went by, you got a blast of hot, toxic air right in the face. And yet, it was a massive success. Why? Because the surface was worse. The streets of Victorian London were so clogged with horses, carriages, and mud that it took hours to get anywhere. The underground, even if it smelled like brimstone, was fast. It proves a point we've seen again and again tonight. People will endure almost any level of discomfort underground if it solves a problem on the surface. Whether it's a peasant hiding from a sword, a monk hiding from a king, or a Victorian businessman hiding from traffic, the motivation is always the same: escape. And this brings us to the weirdest underground reuse in history. During World War II, those same tunnels we've been talking about, the medieval quarries, the mushroom caves, the subways, became vital again. In London, people slept on the subway platforms during the Blitz. We've all seen the photos. But deeper down, weird things were happening. The British Museum evacuated its treasures to a disused tube station. The Elgin marbles were sitting in the dark next to the tracks. In Paris, the French resistance used the catacombs as a headquarters. They were plotting to overthrow the Nazis while surrounded by the bones of 6 million ancestors. But here is the irony. The Nazis were down there too. They built a bunker in the catacombs, directly under the Lycée Montaigne High School. It had steel doors, air filtration, and a telephone line. At one point, the resistance fighters and the Nazi soldiers were in the same tunnel network, separated by only a few hundred meters of darkness and bone walls. A deadly game of cat and mouse, played out in a cemetery. And in the countryside, the ancient souterrains and Erdstalls we talked about in Part 1? They were opened up again. Farmers in 1944 used the same hideouts their ancestors used in 1344. The technology of war had changed. Bombers instead of arrows, tanks instead of knights. But the dirt was still the best armor available. There is a continuity to the underground. It connects us to the past in a very physical way. When you walk into a cellar, you are stepping into a space that exists outside of time. The air is old. The light is artificial. And speaking of artificial light, let's drift towards the weirdest modern obsession with the underground. The preppers. In the 1950s, the fear changed. It wasn't armies or traffic. It was the bomb. And suddenly, the backyard fallout shelter became the ultimate suburban accessory. Keeping up with the Joneses meant having a deeper hole than the Joneses. People bought kits. They buried school buses, They stocked up on canned beans. It was the medieval panic all over again, but with Geiger counters. And just like the medieval peasants, they created a culture around it. A culture of waiting. But there is a funny story about a man in Toronto named Bruce Beach. In the early 1980s, he decided to build the ultimate shelter. He bought 42 old school buses. He buried them. He connected them in a grid, poured concrete over them, and created a complex called Arc 2. It was 10,000 square feet. It had a decontamination shower, a dentist chair, and enough soup to feed an army. Bruce spent his life down there, maintaining the buses, waiting for a nuclear war that never came. He fought with the local council about zoning laws. He fought with the damp. He was the modern equivalent of the alchemist in the cellar. Obsessed, hardworking, and living in a reality slightly adjacent to everyone else's. So, what have we learned tonight? We've learned that humans are really, really good at digging. We've learned that if you give a king a shovel, he'll try to blow up a castle. If you give a monk a shovel, he'll try to find purgatory. And if you give a duke a shovel, he'll paint a tunnel pink. But mostly, we've learned that the ground beneath our feet is not solid. It's Swiss cheese. It's a honeycomb of fears, dreams, and secrets. Every city you walk through has a shadow city beneath it. Every field has a memory of someone hiding in the furrow. So the next time you are in a basement, or a subway station, or even just digging a hole in the garden to plant a petunia, stop for a second. Listen. You might hear the scrape of a medieval pickaxe, or the chant of a hiding priest, or the clip-clop of a donkey walking down a spiral staircase. We are surface dwellers, but our history? Our history is underground. I'm going to leave you there, in the quiet dark. Sleep well, and mind your head.